I'll start by simply congratulating Jeff on the show. It
Thank
was
you,
great
Michael.
to see. I had seen everything before except Abundance. I'd seen a reproduction of that, but I'd never seen it in the flesh. And I went with Ruth, and she hadn't seen a lot of, she'd seen a lot of your work, but there are lots of things she hadn't seen. So that was great. And I also thought the installation was, terrific. And it was great seeing everything again. And I've been thinking, look, I've been going over catalogs and rereading essays and sort of thinking about our conversation. We've never had a sort of set piece conversation before. Almost feels like a strange genre for us.
True enough.
We've had many, many conversations. So I was trying to think what would be the best place to begin? And I thought maybe, you're very interesting always on the topic of how you came to do what you do. Being interested in art from such an early age, entering the scene at a moment after minimalism, after post-minimalism, really a sort of heyday of conceptualism, coming to terms with that, eventually leading to writing your sensational essay, Marks of Indifference, which I do regard as one of the most brilliant essays in art criticism ever. Wow. And then everything else that one knows about your going to the Courtauld, studying earlier art, coming back, seeing a light box, starting to do what you did. I thought I would ask you, checking out dates, and it's sort of striking. By the time I became aware of what was going on in, let's call it tableau size photography, tableau form photography, to use Chevrier's very helpful term, there were quite a number of artists doing it. And I checked the dates. You're actually slightly older than the sort of German generation, for example, the Dusseldorf generation, that comes to the fore in the 1980s. And I was sort of wondering how you think about that, how you would situate yourself historically. I mean, you're part of this huge, well, explosion is too dramatic, but this sudden expansion, sudden emergence of tableau scale photography coming out of a number of places. I mean, you, of course, in Vancouver, Struth et al. In Dusseldorf, Bustamante in France, and so on. It's very striking the way it happens. It's also true that you emerge slightly before the others. Do you have any thoughts about your sense of belonging to a larger generation or being slightly apart from that generation? This is really a question for me. It's curiosity.
I think I feel part of something. I know that I am older than Gursky and the others by about almost 10 years, I think.
That's right. That's exactly right.
About 10 years. And I think that's probably partly because I had a period where I didn't do things for a long time. And that may be, a big factor, because when I left Vancouver to go to London at the beginning of the 70s, I was going through a kind of withdrawal from very youthful experiments with post-minimal conceptual art, which I exhibited locally, but not much more than that, and had kind of gone through fascination with that already by about 1967. So, and for those 3 years, was sort of trying to find out whether that was me. And by the time I left there, because I'm not there at the moment, I'm here at the moment. In other words, I'm in California at the moment. But when I left Vancouver, I was already beginning to feel troubled about it and disappointed with what I was doing. And so then I went to England and stayed there for 3 years and did what I did.
Did you take courses, seminars, things like that?
Yeah, I was a regular student in the Courtauld Institute from 1970 till I left in 73. Mm-hmm. And I did take some courses. And I developed a few relationships there. But between that time and 76, let's say, which is about 6 years, almost 7 years, I really didn't know what to do. So in that period, I aged. I got older. Yes. If I had been less uncertain, or the times had permitted me to be less uncertain, maybe I would have started doing what I was doing earlier. But that didn't happen. There were, in terms of the emergence of the larger scale photography, there were things going on already in the early 70s. I wouldn't say we saw it in the 60s so much, but we did start seeing it in the early 70s of experiments by deploying photography differently. Some of that was coming out of conceptual art, obviously, some of it from other places. And that began to be kind of an opening up factor, whether it was, say, people like Christian Boltanski, who started using photographs in this sort of pseudo-archival way. Mm-hmm. That was in France, or Klaus Rinke in Germany, whose photographs, his documentation of his actions became bigger and bigger. Even some of the Vienna actionists like Schwarzkogler had very elaborate photographic documentation of their performances, etc. And there were a lot of things like that happening between about 1968 even, and let's say the middle of the 70s. It was a very fertile period, which has not been looked at that closely in terms of the precursing of, let's call it 80s photography. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of aware of all of that because I was always looking at what was going on in art. I'd probably seen some of it in London in the early 70s. Even people like Gilbert and George, who were making use of imagery differently, played a part in all that. There's probably several dozen interesting artists who aren't so much looked at now, or at least who aren't so much identified with what you just talked about, but who did play a part in redeploying photographic material inside of different activities of theirs. And it was in Italy, it was in Japan. These things happened all over. And it was a kind of a moment. At the moment, we might, from the point of view we have at the moment, we're talking at the moment, you can see it as precursing something else, but it wasn't really simply precursing something else. It was, and in fact, that kind of hybridized use of photography is still going on everywhere. You see it in all performance documentation type art, in any kind of assemblage using photography, anything to do with action and documentation, which is all those things are still current. It's another direction of how photography got used differently. I wasn't interested in that, but I know that it affected me, and I knew quite a lot about it. I think it would be wonderful to see an exhibition of, let's call it, experimental photography from 1966 to, say, 80 or something like that. Mm-hmm. That didn't include anybody like me or Gursky or anyone, but others who are often, very well-known artists, just in a different direction. You can think of the older ones like Jan Dibbets or people like that. A lot of them are still around working in similar modes to what they were doing then. So
was Ian Wallace part of that to some extent?
Definitely. Mm-hmm. Ian became part of the tableau world for quite some time, mm-hmm. And when Ian and I were, we when we were in Vancouver together in the 60s, we were aware of all that work, and we're talking about it. And maybe you can see more of it filtering into his work, bits and pieces, than you could in anything I've done.
But you, right from the start of what you from the Destroyed Room on, your interest was so pointedly, how can you say, aesthetic. I mean, you were not documenting something. You were not doing performance. You were committed from the first to making pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And you've always been unembarrassed, even under early pressure from the left, about trying to make good pictures and
Mm-hmm.
make things that would be as good as you could make them. And that's just a very striking aspect of your work from the start. And it's, of course, something that once I became aware of it, which was late, I responded to. I have another question about the years in England. In fact, we overlapped for 6 months of that time. I was in London in '71.
Mm-hmm.
Were you aware, and I actually did some teaching at St. Martin's in the advanced sculpture program under Caro. Were you aware of Caro and what he was doing and well, you mentioned Gilbert and George, so you would be aware of, that aspect of the
Michael, I
St.
was aware of everything you had written by then.
I see.
I knew what you had written, and you had written about Caro, and I knew about Caro, and I was interested in all that stuff. So yes, and when I was in London, I made a point of seeing exhibitions wherever I could. I went around all the galleries of London at that time.
Yeah, I'm sure you did.
Galleries. I went to the auctions at which is the auction house on Bond Street. One of the two big auction houses. I used to go to the auction previews to see what was there and everything else. I mean, that's what I did in London. I immersed myself in what was going on. So yeah, I knew about that work.
Casman ran an interesting gallery at that time.
I went to Casman all the time. Whenever there was a show on, I saw lots of shows there. Casman, Nigel Greenwood, Listen, Marlborough, Fisher and Company.
Yes.
What are the other galleries that one went to in those days? Robert Fraser.
Waddington, probably.
Waddington, etc. I went to all the galleries and of course went to the Filmmakers Co-op and saw a lot of experimental film at the time, which also played a part in kind of forming what I was thinking about doing. So yes, I was one of those people who was always interested in what was happening in art of any period. So I was always looking.
Well, it actually sounds like that was a very useful time of looking and taking stuff in and thinking and not yet making, because once you started to make, you knew what you were doing, and at least everything gets underway very fast.
There was a lot of compressed energy, I think, when I began in the 1970s to make my pictures. And I've said it a couple of times that I think my first few pictures, like Destroyed Room and Picture of Women, were really London pictures. They came from me, from the experience I had in London over those years, which was an immersion in the arts that you can only get in a big capital city. I didn't come from a place like that, and so for me to go to London was a huge transformation of my ability to see things, because previously I had just seen them in reproduction for the most part, having to be in Vancouver, and not only see art as it was, but meet some of the people and listen to how they talked and be part of art more than it was. And it was a huge change for me. And on top of that, it was intellectually a very interesting time in London in the early 70s. You can remember what was going on. There's a lot of things happening on the side of just general cultural thinking, political thinking, artistic thinking that were troublesome, very turbulent time. And a lot of debate, which was much easier to feel in a place like London than a faraway city like Vancouver. I'd learned to feel those things artificially from far away because that's what one does in a small place. But getting closer in, it had a real different impact on me. And I think that when I made something like Picture for Women, which really comes out of going to the Warburg and looking at that Manet,
of course,
in the context of what was going on in London at the time overall, it wasn't like going to the Warburg and dropping out of time and then just thinking about Manet or something. That's not what I did. It was something in the circulation of all the other things that were going on.
sure.
And
Screen magazine. I mean, it was so many issues immediately impacted on it.
well, there was so many troublesome, let's call them troubled, troubling ways of thinking about what the arts were at that time. It was fortunate because that troublesomeness was very, very inspiring, actually. So I think of the pictures I did then as crisscrossed with a kind of rejection reaction to hardcore conceptual art, doubts about the nature of the dematerialization of art that was taking place at the time, doubts about the end game of post-minimalist, experimentation, whether it was someone like Buren and all of that, flooding of the moving image into the situation. Of course, photography being redeployed, as we were talking about before. All of those things were really happening at the same time. And I think that the outcome for me was kind of a revision of the 70s orthodoxy about what the avant-garde and neo-avant-garde forms of art ought to be, And I probably became, in some ways, what I did, I think, was a sort of a reaction formation to limitations I felt in those experimental art forms, which I took very seriously. So my reaction formation wasn't a kind of anti-vaxxer attitude.
Right.
It was coming through the middle of all that stuff to a different place.
It's very interesting. So those early works, the ones you've mentioned, also the double self-portrait, I can sort of see those in relation to the kind of London scene, the way you describe it.
Like I said, I think those pictures are essentially London pictures. They're made by that world. After I came back from London, that sort of aspect probably faded to some degree, but I don't feel it's ever really faded. I think that I was made as an artist by going to London.
That's that is interesting. And that's a stronger statement than anything I'd have, just realized.
I specifically did not go to New York, by the way, at that time. Just occurs to me now. I would have been able to go to do my studies in New York because I had an acceptance at one of the schools there. I forget which one. And I could have gone to New York just as well. But something about New York at that time made me feel that was not going to be the place for me. I can't even explain it to myself even now or to you, clearly thinking that that was not the place for me. Maybe because of the powerful strains of New York, late New York schoolism. I don't know exactly. It would be something I'd have to think about more. Maybe I will now. But I remember that very clearly, and choosing London because it was Europe and because it was not New York. And that's not because I was against things that were happening there. I didn't feel like I had an instinct that there was no path for me there.
Yeah, you probably had more room in London. And you avoided the kind of polarization that was already, a major feature of everything going on in New York.
Yeah, it was partly caused by art and objecthood, as you might remember.
Well, yeah.
And I was a very careful reader of art and objecthood, as we've discussed many times. And that your position meant a lot at that time, because I felt you had put your finger on some essential disturbance in some of my own ideals that 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 made your position difficult in the current space of attitudes in New York around 1970. And there was so much opposition to what you had said, which was fascinating, and obviously you know. And I remember feeling that I would be swept up in that opposition somehow, and didn't want to be. I wanted to have my own, some sort of another space to consider those problems, because it was a very powerful intellectual effect that had on me, because of the claim that you were making about the aesthetic experience of artwork as an illusion as well as an actuality that was so much against the grain at that moment.
Yes.
That it made me feel like, because I had a sympathy which I couldn't really explain clearly at that time, I had a sympathy towards the position you were taking, even though I didn't necessarily agree with everything you said, but I had a great sympathy with the position you were taking. I had a feeling that to weather a storm of, or to be in a context, because I would have been if I'd gone there in some way, I would have been, at least personally, to weather a storm of opposition from a direction that didn't convince me seemed like a kind of a trouble I didn't seem to need to take on. I'm maybe not making it very clear, but because I sympathized with your conclusions, I felt New York would have been a place that would have, would have created some sort of obstacles that I avoided. I wanted to avoid without really understanding it.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. What I was actually thinking of, talking about how fraught things were in New York at that time, is perfectly true about art and objecthood. But I was actually thinking of the role of Greenberg and let's call it the demonization of Greenberg, which persists absolutely to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a complicated situation for me, because by the time I wrote Art and Objecthood, I wasn't seeing Greenberg. I mean, Greenberg was an incredibly difficult person. Greenberg was in many ways as unpleasant as people think he was. But it wasn't out of he gets misdescribed. That would be a long story, but it's not as if he was trying consciously to control things. He was just being the way he is, and the way he was. And the way he was not at all pleasant, and it was very domineering. And just on a person-to-person level, he tried to dominate. And then there was this huge kickback against him. By the time you're talking about, you had the very strong reaction against color field, which persists to this day. In the first place through minimalism, but also then the rise of a journal like October, postmodernism, and so on. So everything, there was nothing like a clean take available on things. If you were going to talk about Morris Louis, it was already infected with a generalized hatred or resentment of Greenberg and a desire to see him, to bring him down. And I understand that. I mean, this is not a pleasant man. My relations with him became completely untenable very early. He was very, very nice to you at the start if you were young, and you sort of came to him prepared to be influenced by him. But very early on, he was not happy with anyone's independence. He was not happy with anyone's, developing influence in their own right. He was not at all happy with the fact that various painters liked having me in the studio. The studio was completely his realm, and so on and so forth. Anyway, he was in all those ways impossible. But what I'm saying is, New York was just riven by all those kinds of issues. Yeah, yes, the issues around art and objecthood. I remember running into, a number of artists, including Flavin, one day in the street just on Fifth Avenue, and I thought I was going to get assaulted. I thought it was going to be like a picture of this guys fighting in the street. The hostility was so great. What saved me from, what can I say, from a certain involvement with that, by 70, I was in a way out of the situation. I was in Cambridge, I was at Harvard, I had that distance. I would come down to New York regularly and stay a night or two with Frank Stella and go look at things. But I'd even kind of bailed out critically by that time.
Yes, because you'd already published your thing on Manet by that time.
That was 69.
And I remember thinking, Michael Fried has now made his point, and he's now going to go and find the historical origins of what he just finished saying. That's how I interpreted Manet's sources at that time. And so that, in a way, and then you'd gone on, then you kind of went off to be more of an art historian. But Greenberg, for me, since I was in Vancouver, his personality and all that meant nothing. What was valuable for me was his writing, which Absolutely. Was pretty much unparalleled for its style and its insight. And I didn't care about any of those things because that's really a local social problem for, say, New York. I was aware of it because of all the controversy, but it didn't mean anything to me. I liked Greenberg's writing because of what I learned from it. And I also thought he could write. And his style was the style of he had the kind of art critical style that made you want to think about what he had to say. Because somebody who could write like that obviously was a person whose judgment could mean something. That's all that I had to worry about with Greenberg, and it made it easy for me.
No, that's totally right. And I mean, that was my relation to it before everything went south. I think that's completely right. And the best critical essays, the essay on Cézanne, the essays on Monet, the great essay on collage. I mean, those are, as the French say, incontournables.
I gravitated toward where I saw the energy coming from that was of use to me. And the rest of it was important, but avoidable, at least as far as I was concerned. So I wasn't strictly a Greenbergian. I didn't necessarily think that Ulitsky was the greatest painter of the time. I didn't necessarily agree with you. I think that some of the other artists who were more into the minimal field were very good as well. So I didn't really take sides on that because I didn't think it was necessary and it didn't do me any good. I mean, one of my ways of looking at it is this way of thinking going to help me in any way? Is it in my interests, shall we say? Is it in my artistic interest to think that way? And that's how I will reflect on things. And it didn't suit me to take sides between, say, Robert Smithson and Kenneth Noland. It didn't interest me because I was capable of getting something from either of those artists at the same time. And it would just be whatever I could make of it. So I didn't really engage in that polemic or take sides, but I did gravitate to where I thought the interesting, let's call it, energy is coming from. That's why I liked Smithson at the time, because he was doing interesting things. I thought the way he was putting photographs together with his writing was really fascinating. And he did a couple of things in art form that were really important. They were completely on a different track, but they meant something. So I didn't want...
in retrospect, that's clear to me too. And even at the time, I mean, I never wrote against Smithson.
No, that wasn't your interest.
No, and what was clear was that whatever else is the case, the guy was brilliant.
He was an interesting artist, and Carl Onder is an interesting artist, and Flavin was an interesting artist, and those people were also good artists. I agreed with Greenberg. It's always the results that you judge, nothing else.
Absolutely.
So I always went for the results, and in any case, avoiding New York was an instinctive thing that like I said, I don't think I can even articulate it very clearly now, but I did do it, and that's how I ended up in London, which did have at that time extremely open spaces for ways of thinking, flows of attitude, new influences, translations. That whole emigre aspect of London, which is not really appreciated as much as it is in New York, the mixture of people from all sorts of places. All of those things, I think, helped me a lot.
I can imagine it. So this has all been background, and it's been fascinating. And anyway, I think really I think you were quite right to avoid New York, because I think it was a battleground, and it was a battleground
Never know.
of issues.
I'll never know if I was right.
Yeah, I think you were. It, was not. They weren't your issues. You didn't have to buy into that.
Maybe that's true.
Yeah. What I regret about the whole thing is that it's affected the reception of something like Color Field to this day. I mean, what one needs are a couple of very good exhibitions on those grounds to see how good they are. Back in 2014, the Mnuchin Gallery in New York put on a show of Louis Vails. And I was very, very involved with Louis. I got he died just before I returned from England. After my 3 years, 2 at Oxford and then 1 in London. I came back in the sort of end of the summer of 1962. And it was just the moment that Louis died. So I never met him, and I had only seen a handful of his paintings. And at that point, I became aware of his paintings, and I was knocked out by them. And I became very involved with them, and I did the first retrospective of his work in 66, 67. I wrote an early book on him. I went and saw everything that he did, a lot of it in the warehouse, a lot of it with Greenberg. This is when my relations with him were solid, and I learned a lot sort of looking with him. And I tremendously admired the Vails, these large pictures that Louis did between the mid-50s, but really 57, 58, before he started doing the unfurls. And I was tremendously impressed with him. And then Mnuchin put on this show. And it was my first look at a gathering of the Vails in decades. Mm-hmm. And I was simply staggered by how good they were, how monumental they were. They really were just, the best of them, just transcendently good. And there was, like very little reaction to them. Peter Schjeldahl in the New Yorker talked about the color field painting as being like what you feel at the end of the day when you have a martini or two, something like that, kind of nice warm fuzz. Whereas these things were just overwhelming. And I still have this fantasy. We've talked about this before. That someday I'd love to. Well, I won't live long enough, but for some of that to come right. The best of Olitsky has just never really been taken in. David Mirvish in Toronto owns a number of stunning Olitskys from 69 and 70, and someday they need to surface and be seen for what they are. In any case, all of this is relevant to my relations to you, because I was unaware of your early work. I was unaware of what was going on in photography. I had stopped writing art criticism. I was not uninterested in what was happening in the world of art, but I had not let's say, as of 1990, taken in and what was happening in photography. And you'll remember that we met by chance at the Boymont Museum in Rotterdam in '96. I went and looked it up. It was when your monument there was, in effect, unveiled. And there was a small show of paint. Was the Adrian Walker shown there at that time?
I think so.
I think so. I think so. That was, you know, a certain kind of revelation to me. And yes, I had seen some of your work because, to be honest, I had thought, I mean, it's a very common form of academic insanity for professors to think that somebody else has read what they've done. But with the various things like the Adrian Walker, I thought, you know, it's like this guy has read Absorption and Theatrics. Oh, no, it can't possibly be. And then when we met, it emerged that that was true. And that was deeply, deeply encouraging. And it meant that really right from the start, in terms of my interest in you, I saw the deep historical roots of your project. I mean, what's so striking about your project is that it's, you know, resolutely, absolutely contemporary all the way. And you activate various, I don't even want to use the word sources, but in the history of painting, that make them alive again. And for me, that was quite thrilling because, again, for me, you need to understand this, there was never any conflict between abstract art and older art. I mean, I started out loving Manet and so on and so forth, and then got involved with Pollock and post-Pollock painting, and then became interested in how it all related. But there was never a conflict. Looking at things was like the same thing. Another way of putting it is I realized very early on, I was lucky enough to meet Frank Stella when I was still an undergraduate at Princeton. I was like 16 when I met Frank. And that was a huge influence on me. But the other thing that I realized right away was that I was completely comfortable looking at abstract art, at least as comfortable as I was looking at representational art, maybe more so. So there was never any conflict. And then your work was like a complete emblem of that. The blow-away experience of your work for me, to this day, was encountering Morning Cleaning Barcelona Pavilion.
Where did you see it? In New York?
I saw it. I went back and figured out where I saw it. I saw it in Frankfurt at the Städel. There was if you remember, there was a brilliant little exhibition.
Yes, I remember the very good show.
Sure, very brilliant. That painting, and then a couple of small paintings by the Dutch 17th century painter, Ellinga.
That's right.
And I was in Frankfurt for some other reason. I can't remember. You know, I was brought there to give a talk or something. Can't really remember. And whenever you're in Frankfurt, you go to the Städel. And I went to the Städel, and there this was. And so that was, I think, let me see, I think it was 96 maybe?
Could be.
Could be.
Probably around there.
Around the same time we met even. I actually made a note. Give me a second.
I could look it up, but I'd have to go off my.
No. I did look it up. That's why I'm just looking at my. No, it was 2002. At the Städel in 2002 with some paintings by Peter Janssens Ellinga. And that, for me, that was the complete revelation. Because for me, there was, in a way, no difference between looking at that painting and, let's say, looking at a Lewis Unfurled. That painting is, I think, something like 12 feet wide. A Lewis Unfurled is 14 feet wide. Both paintings are in their different ways, totally flooded with light. Both paintings, both works have, brilliant color. Both works actually use liquid. It was an extraordinary experience seeing that picture. And I went back. I stayed there a few days. I just went back to that picture. But if you are the kind of person, I have to say, like, that both of us are, that's it. I mean, if you are totally knocked out, totally persuaded by something, that's a permanent fact of your consciousness, like forever. Nothing can dislodge it. Nothing can qualify it. Nothing can dispersuade you about it. So from that moment on, I was completely committed to paying very, very close attention to your work. I mean, I was already doing it after that early encounter, but morning cleaning was a huge thing for me. I mean, it remains that. So it's one of the, in my lifetime as I don't even want to say as a critic, but as someone very seriously involved with contemporary art, there are these moments. And you live for those moments. I mean, the first time I entered Caro's courtyard and saw Midday 1960 was one of those moments. Mm-hmm. It was just, nothing can ever dislodge it. I knew I was looking at a totally great work of art. So that was for me. If there's anything I miss in any subsequent show, I just love to look at morning cleaning. But that's where I encountered it for the first time.
And you didn't see it at Glenstone, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I never thought that there was such a thing as old art. Even as a child, I remember thinking that art that I was impressed by was happening at that moment. It didn't really matter when it was made. It came to life again at that moment. I remember that as one of my earliest memories of experiencing art. And I've always, that aspiration to make works of art that never feel old just seemed to come naturally to me as almost an unquestioned value. And so I know that was always what I wanted to accomplish at any given moment. And the idea that there was such a thing as outmoded art, which was another part of that rhetoric of the times, was difficult for me because I couldn't really ever accept it. And I found myself having adverse reactions to any discussion of the obsolescence of art forms, which was, again, very powerful in the 60s and 70s. And as again, has stayed powerful right through to today, since you have the idea of this techno-futurist idea about what culture should be still very powerful. But that was never my experience. My experience was that works of art are always now. And I think that also helped I think it helped me, and would probably help any artist to free themselves to appreciating art from other places and times, and not necessarily having to be as contemporary as one is expected to be. There's a certain contemporaneity that artists are, there's a lot of pressure to be contemporary or now or in the present, which can be very one-dimensional. And it seems to me that there is no conflict between, let's say, something of the past that has a value in it that in my view, in my work, let's say, in my view of how I do it, if there's a value in some specific work of art, let's say, or even a range of them, that value becomes available to me immediately. I recognize it. And immediately I can connect it with something I want to do, which I might not have wanted to do or realized until I recognized that value or recognized it again or came back to it. And so, I mean, I'm glad that you see it that way, because that's how I wanted to make my pictures, such that they would fuse that, that very conventional idea that there's something that is permanent and something that is of the moment. And the fusion of those two things is the apex of what you can accomplish, or at least aspire to. And
kind of Baudelairean ideal, actually.
he put it very succinctly, so it kind of gets identified with him, but it's not his. It's something that I think every artist who's reached a certain point of their development, regardless of their accomplishment, even just their development, their attitude, has to accept. It's almost an unavoidable conclusion. In other words, an artist may have this consciousness and not accomplish anything very significant. We have to accept the fact that there are very interesting people who have extremely evolved and even creative views of what good art is, but they haven't been able to get there themselves. And I think that it's important to respect that about a lot of artists who we feel much more critical about, because they also see it. It's not, and one of the reasons they see it is because it's not hard to see. If you have an appreciation for art and beauty, you see it. It's almost natural. You realize that something from the 15th century or any century lives now as you experience it and as you can appreciate it. That aesthetic pleasure just doesn't age. And that's something, of course, that also was under contention in that period we were talking about. It was being questioned, and I think the questioning was important. I went through that questioning myself, and I found myself very disappointed in my own state of mind as the outcome of that process. And so when I realized that, I turned away from that. I didn't turn away from the process of questioning that, but turned away from that solution. In other words, that there was a fundamental new, which had a very it rejected the old in some way. That never interested me, and so I had to turn against that. And in that sense, I think that my work has that reactionary aspect to it that it's been accused of. But the reactionary aspect of it is, I think, a creative part of it, an important part of it. I don't mean politically reactionary either. I just mean reaction to a set of circumstances that had become orthodox.
Yeah, well, needless to say, I'm deeply sympathetic to that. This has been great, Jeff. Maybe this is a good moment to talk about some specific works.
As you wish.
So one of the experiences I had going through the show at Glenstone, I mean, I've had it before, but there are works of yours that deliver themselves. I mean, this is true of all art. There are works, of course, it depends on the viewer, but deliver themselves very quickly, instantaneous. For me, Morning Cleaning was one of those. It was like almost before I took in what it was of, I was totally persuaded. And then there are works that are much slower to operate on one, and which repay repeated, or require even for a particular viewer, repeated looking and paying a certain kind of attention. So a photo that I think for a long time didn't mean anything especially strong to me, but has grown and grown. Sort of open the catalog to it so that I'm looking at it while I talk to you about it, is Volunteer. This large black and white photo and I'm sure Glenstone will patch this into our conversation at this point. This guy mopping the floor. It's large. He just is, paying a certain kind of standard attention to what he's doing. It's one of the early black and white photos, yes?
Yes, it's maybe, yes, it's one of the first 4 or 5.
1996.
Yeah, it's when I began to make them.
Yes. So it can be very, very, very hard to sort of, this is the, let's say the critic, the job of somebody who does what I do, but very hard to exactly put into words what it is that seems to be going on. He seems to be, in a low grade sort of way, as it were, absorbed in what he's doing. But of course, it's totally clear that this isn't a candid photo. I mean, just the overall context and project means it can't be candid. The size turns out to be so important. And I take it, I mean, when you started to make this photo, did you already have a sense of what you thought, what kind of size or scale you thought it might come out as?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
By
very
the
much
way,
you realize yeah.
You realize that he's also mopping the floor just like the other guy in morning cleaning. You realize that.
Right.
Maybe you just are drawn to that.
No, you're the one who's drawn to that.
I am drawn. I am drawn to it.
You're drawn to cleaning. Yes.
I am drawn to such things. I think that cleaning is it's so fundamental to human order that it's just endlessly fascinating. The whole process is anthropologically fascinating, but we don't have to get into that in any detail. But it is inherently a fascinating theme.
Yeah. I've always loved that very simple photo of yours of a hand holding a piece of cloth that has just been washed.
And it didn't get that clean, which was what set that picture off. Just as a aside, I had that rag. I had that rag in my studio, and I used it for cleaning things. And it got stained in certain ways that it could never become clean again. So no matter how much you washed it, some of the stains wouldn't come out. Now that's utterly fascinating, that it is both clean and not clean at the same time. Mm-hmm. It's just poetically fascinating. Almost like there's a passage where Hegel, and I hate to quote this because it seems preposterously large, talks about the role it's played in his thought, in thought about things like holes in socks. I mean, that is those are inherently fascinating motifs because they contain aversions, aspirations, fears, etc. We have an aversion maybe to the dirty and the attraction to the clean, but maybe not, etc., etc. And so those themes do set me off because they contain energy that I am very attached to. I also feel that cleaning has to do with virtue. I mean, in the old-fashioned sense of the virtues. And I've tried sometimes to depict the virtues because they're a wonderful, deep source. It's not a program, it's just these things come up because I care about them so much. So I had seen someone doing that, volunteer who was cleaning up in a place like that. I'd seen it through the window of a place, and the subject immediately struck me as being what I needed to do. And I knew that it had to be large because I wanted you to feel very close to that man, even though he was some way back in the picture.
Mm.
And in any case, in most of my pictures, I assume that the picture will be rather large because, not because I want to make a large tableau, but because the physical experience of the entities that make up the subject, but also the forms, need to be uh, apprehensible, but emphatically so. So, for example, what was very important was the size of the mop, because the shape that the mop is making is
Mhm.
wonderful. It's like flowing water, like one of those Da
Yes.
Vinci drawings of water flowing, because the mop changes as you use it. And that's another thing about tools and implements, is that they keep changing as you use them, and that complicates how you use them. It's also like a paintbrush. When you're painting, the brush changes shape as the painter paints, and he has to somehow deal with the accidents that will happen as the brush changes shape. Well, it's the same with the mop. So all of those things, set me off. And it just seemed like a wonderful subject of a man alone in his own world, laboring for the benefit of others, which I think is important. And when I was photographing it, I looked for, or I thought I was looking for, a moment in which his expression, his face, um, contains more than the absorption in his task. And I didn't really know what that was going to be, but I hoped for it. And I think in the picture that I made, and it's not necessarily that easy to see in reproduction because it needs to be seen in the real
Yes.
scale, there's a kind of um, subtle pleasure of mood that I captured that was very important. And so the origins are in these personal values of mine, like any, but that's like any artist starts from triggering off of some uh, um, contact with their values, their hopes, their things that they care about. That's where volunteer came from. And the realization of it was, everything I did, I aimed at trying to accomplish that end, even though I couldn't see it in my mind's eye before it was done. But as I worked with him for quite a few days, then I began to see the picture. I photograph a lot because I can, but also in the process of photographing a lot, I learned to see what I'm looking at. And that helps me. It doesn't help everybody. And a lot of photographers would find that endlessly tiresome, extraneous, and overcooked. But it helps me. I didn't see him for, in other words, I didn't see what I was trying to see him doing for a few days. I didn't see it. I just saw the subject. I didn't see it. And
Mm.
it's the same with all the pictures I've done to some degree. Some are easier to come by and others are not as easy to come by. But it's always about finding the moment where I'm actually seeing it. And hopefully at that point I can capture it.
Well, I think you made a sort of brilliant choice of the person. Did you consider a number? Was this one of those pictures where you auditioned a number of people or checked out a number of people? Possible
I'm trying to
characters?
remember. I know that I did something unusual there that I hadn't done before. And I don't think I have done it since, which was I had found somewhere a written memoir of somebody, and I've lost it. I lost the original piece of paper. I know I should have kept it, but I know I've lost it. Um, in which someone talked about his own experience of volunteering, not about mopping, but about volunteering, and it really struck me what he had to say. I can't quote it very well, but it had to do with him discovering himself again and him discovering what he should do in life or something like that. And it was
Mhm.
very simple. It wasn't literary, and I had it. and I thought, and that's where the picture began to take shape. And uh, and it was written by clearly a man about the age of the person in the picture. So I chose him, and I know I got him from some oblique source, and I seriously can't remember what it was because I didn't look at very many people. I found him almost immediately, and he seemed to be the right guy. I know that I found him in relation to the area that he's working in the picture, which is the area where those missions and drop-in centers are. So maybe he had something to do with it. I'm sorry, but it's getting to be a long time ago. I can't remember all the details.
Right.
But anyway, I did pick him because he seemed like the echo of the person speaking in the text. And I found him some odd way, which isn't the normal way I find people.
Well, the other thing that's so, striking about the photo, and this is often the case. I mean,
Oh, I just did. Sorry,
yes,
I remember. I found him at one of those drop-in centers. I went there. I went to several of them, which were not far from my studio, and I met some people there, and it was a paying job, and I found him in one of those places. That's what. So he came from that world.
Well, it was a great choice, and you sort of feel. I mean, you can know that it was, as it were, posed or whatever, but he conveys a sense of reality and a kind of thoughtfulness.
Yeah, well, it was quite real.
Inwardness that comes across in the photo.
One of the ways I got that, by the way, was that I hired him for a month, and I hired him to mop my space, and I hired him for a month. So he got paid for a whole month, which was great for him. And I just said, you have to come and mop every night at 8 o'clock or whatever it was. And I'm not going to talk too much. And I didn't. And I barely directed him or talked to him for the whole time. I mean, evenings, we would shoot for an hour, let's say, in the evening. And we barely exchanged a word except hello and thanks. Because those are the rules I set. I did not want to direct him. And so I had to photograph him a lot. And it was real. He was coming to do his job. He wasn't necessarily making a picture with me, or he was, but there was another layer to it. And I've used this many times before, getting people to do something often repeatedly and often enough that they get tired of the idea that they're making a picture and they just do it.
Yes.
And that's something that comes from, obviously, from learning something about film directing.
Yes. It's kind of Bresson and others doing stuff. But I mean, this also touches on, sort of, I'm just editorializing here. I mean, one of the basic ideas about photography that just always seemed to me so wrong is that if somebody knows they're being photographed, you can always tell that that they'll only look as if they're caught up in what they're doing or really reading or really mopping the floor if they don't know they're being photographed. This is a Susan Sontag idea, but it's a vulgarization that's very, very widespread. It's just a very common assumption. And even apart from you, it just has always seemed to me like ridiculous and wrong. And it's, your work is like repeated proof again and again about that. The other thing that's striking about, one of the other things that's striking about Volunteer is, imagine that the photo lost its entire right-hand half. If it were cropped just in on the figure.
Okay.
And it would have a very, very different feel. I mean, one of the things that you very, very often do, the famous remark about photography is a very generous medium. You think you're taking a photo of Uncle Jack, but you're getting the dog pissing against the fence too. But in a serious way, you get think of the women plucking the chickens. I mean, the unbelievable multifariousness of that interior. But here, so much of the, how can I say, the force of the picture derives from the overall framing and how much of the reality of the room we're given at the right. And the fascinating thing about it is that there isn't, so to speak, what can I to use philosophical language, an ontological contrast between the idea of his state of mind and everything that's outside him. I mean, what's outside him is in him. What's in him is outside him. There's a flow, an exchange between the two, so that his whole activity, his whole state of mind would read differently if we were just given him. I mean, the effectiveness of the photo is so involved in our being able to take in everything around him and then return to him, and then go out again and return to him. Also gives us a sense of the dimensions of the space that he's going to be cleaning. Mm-hmm. Anyways, so for me, a certain measure of the brilliance of the photo has to do also, you know, first of all, the scale and the handling of light and dark, but also the amount of the environment that we're given, and then what photography can do with it, which is different from what painting can do with it.
Well, it can be different, but it can also be very close. I think that there are two criteria that I think are in play that matter to me. One was the fact that the emotional content of a picture, or even its intellectual content or its meaning, insofar as there's a person in a picture, that is not limited to the emotion or feeling or attitude expressed by the person, but by the whole picture. Matisse made this point that, you know, the emotion of an image is not determined by the expression on the face of the person or even their gesture. And often he even eliminated the faces of people to make that emphatic, but by everything: the color, the formal relationships, the balance, etc. All the fundamentals, which I completely agree with and always try and work in that context, with that attitude, which is, you know, the little, just the forms in the picture, the shapes, the disposition of lights and darks, etc. That's where the ontology comes from. And the other aspect I think that's important is the literary side of it. In other words, kind of a reiteration of what we see in writing. And Balzac made this point very clearly once, someone made it about him, that his descriptions of interiors are actually descriptions of the people's souls that occupy those interiors. And that principle is obvious to me as a fundamental artistic principle, that everything that appears and it is made to appear has equal status in causing the picture to feel the way it feels or convince the way it convinces.
Yes, well, it's certainly true here.
It also has a lot to do with painting that picture, because there's a large mural on the wall.
I was going to say the one of the little gifts of the picture is that amazing mural with those little abstract birds and mountains and so on.
And that's the kind of mural that is painted in places like that to uplift people who are feeling down.
Yeah.
And so that plays a part too, that the picture itself tries to uplift people that are feeling down. It was part of my intention.
Well, it's a terrific photo in my view.
It had a lot to do also with making it in black and white, Michael, because I wanted to drain the color from the world to make it somehow more mysterious. And the fact that the mural is not in color, I think, has a lot to do with the mood of the whole picture. Mm-hmm. The fact that the color has dramatically vanished. There's a vanishing that always takes place with black and white photography that I think is important too.
Well, the brightness of his little T-shirt is striking as well.
Black and white is all about tonal range and luminosity. And so one works with that. And when I decide to work in black and white, it's because there's a suppression of color that needs to take place. That's very much part of the way I think about it, that there's color has to be suppressed in order for what that picture is going to reveal to reveal that thing. There has to be a cancellation of color. In that case, I think the mural was the key to that cancellation.
That makes sense. Hey, going back to the cleaning motif just for 1 second. When I first became interested in your work, and I was struck by that small photo of the hand holding the piece of rag that hadn't become completely clean, I couldn't help associating that with the pieces of cloth in Evans's photographs of the interiors of the, tenant farmers in.
There's a beautiful photo of the corner where there's some cleaning cloth hanging up.
Exactly. And I found myself actually wondering whether, now I would be more critical of myself, but whether or not that you had that in mind. It was as if your gesture of connection with Evans to have taken his cloth and washed it.
Not directly, but I do have Evans permanently in mind, in fact. And so there has to be some energy passing from Evans to me, just the way there's energy passing from a lot of other artists who admire to me all the time. I just feel like if you love the arts, you're always sort of in their stream, and it's as if you plankton of art energy always coming toward you, and it's always part of your daily intake, and it will set off certain things at certain moments. So of course it had to do with. I also loved, by the way, in that picture, I loved the fact that the cloth was a rectangle. And essentially, that cloth is a rectangle, but it's viewed only in distortion. And distortion is so much part of photography, like the mop in that picture. Acts of distortion where things that have a shape change their shape in front of your eyes because you're seeing them from a certain angle, or because they are themselves in a state of distorting themselves, like a cloth being torqued or something. That is essential. To me, that's very essentially photographic because of the nature of the lens and the fact that photography uses the one-point perspective of the lens in such a dynamic way. Some people have considered that as sort of a limitation of photographic seeing, but I don't. I think that the spherical lens is the most magnificent visual energy technology that we have. After all, we have two of them in our heads, our eyes, our spherical, near spherical, image focusing devices. And I work with that spherical nature a lot. And distortion of form is always, essentially part of what photography can do. The rectangularity of the cloth also reminded me of a monochrome painting. And I thought, actually, you're looking at something that if it was held up properly,
right,
would look like a little painting. But you'll never see it that way because of what happens. And therefore, the fact that can't be seen, the can't be seenness of the actuality of the thing. If you took your hat and twisted it right now, we couldn't really experience it as a hat. We could identify it as a hat, but we wouldn't necessarily experience it as a hat. It's too distorted, but we would experience this dynamic thing for an instant. And of course, the other great thing about that, and it has to do with volunteer as well, is that mop or that expression on his face is only there for a hundredth of a second. And that's something that is lying in the background of every photographic experience, which is very different from painting. We never have that sense of the unmitigated sense of the instantaneity of that capture. In the most realistic paintings that are photographic, like, Velasquez is a great example. It approximates that, but we never really experienced that because it didn't happen. He synthesized it by means of, a laborious painting process. And so it can never be the same, even though they draw together and get in a very interesting dialogue with each other. But then but painting can never do that. So there's always these echoes of what is not painting in photography. And I find that very impressive and important to me. It's not important to other photographers. They don't want to have anything to do with painting. And I don't have any objection to that either. I just think it works for me.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I'm glad I asked you about that little picture, which that was one of the early works that kind of fascinated me when I started to be involved with your work. Let's talk a bit, if you're willing, I'm sure you are, the triptych called Staircase in Two Rooms.
Yep.
Which is 2014, and which is in the Glenstone show.
It's also here in my exhibition in LA.
I see. Oh, you're having it at Gagosian in LA, is that it?
Yes, it's pictures, new pictures, and most of them were made here in LA. So we're making a show of things that are seen here that were made here that have never been seen here, including some older ones.
I see. And has that opened yet?
Yeah, it's been open for a month.
Oh, okay. Great. But does this include pictures I haven't seen yet in some form or other? Trying to think.
I think I sent you a lot of my new pictures, didn't I?
Like I think so.
Like the actor.
Yes.
And all those ones.
Yeah.
Those are in the show.
Yes. Oh, I wish I could see it. So this is the triptych. Photo at the left, we see a doorway partly open, a guy partly visible through the doorway. Middle photo, we see a closed door and a flight of stairs, and we look down a hallway. And the photo on the right, we're inside a room with a man almost like on the edge of a bed. And again, this was a work that it took me a while to come to terms with it. Put it this way, I mean, in terms of color, in terms of form, it's not in the first place obviously beautiful. There's something, as it were, harsh and angular about it. The colors demanding, working off of that kind of reddish brown norm. And then inside the room, there's much more brightness, and there's a bed cover which actually recapitulates that reddish brown in it. But again, I saw this, I've seen this a number of times, or a few times anyway, and I've spent time in front of it. And I'm deeply persuaded by it. And I'm fascinated by the diptychs and triptychs in general. For me, this is an extremely successful triptych. And so here's something that seems to me to go on in a work like this. It goes on in all the polyptychs, I mean diptychs, triptychs. And that is a certain forced displacement of attention into the lateral plane. Mm-hmm. So you've got all the depth of photography, and the depth here is emphasized in all three units by the perspectival recession and the use of straight lines. So it's a three takes on perspectival spaces. But at the same time, you can't help, well, there are sort of two things. First is something like almost the intellectual labor of trying to construe the relations among the parts, which would also be in particular the spatial relations between the two images, the one on the left and the one in the center. Like, is that doorway the same as the doorway we see? Well, no, it can't be, because the stairs begin right there. So, but nevertheless, it would seem to be part of something like the same hallway, and so on and so forth. And there are other, of your polyptychs, the summer afternoon one in particular, which I could say invites that more. But what is striking is you are led after a time in a, not to coin a term, but in a formal way, to move your eye laterally across the pictures, following the play of those angles and recessions and color relations, so that one ends up with a very, in fact, complex, almost want to say Stella-like structure, thinking of an earlier moment in Stella, these Polish birds, with these angled elements existing in some almost sculptural relation to one another. So taken as a whole, it kind of doesn't let me alone. As long as I stand there, I'm doing a certain kind of intensive, as it were, formal looking. And then, of course, we come, I think it's sort of brilliant, because there is a sort of left to right feel to the work. And then at the right, we have this very interesting, as often in your work, almost slightly sexually indeterminate figure reclining on the bed. And the light in the room. Anyway, it's a work of, take it as a whole, of really, I think, great complexity and structural sophistication. So I haven't come to the end of my looking at it yet, but I think it's very, very strong on those kinds of. I mean, there are works, and one loves them, where the sense of their being brilliantly resolved, almost in the flash of an instant, just coming together, being completely resolved. You get, that's wonderful. And then there are ones that deliver themselves much more slowly over time, maybe never completely. But if they work, they hook you. And for me, this is very much a work in that vein.
Interesting. There's the lateral displacement. Just to comment first. It's always the case. It has always been the case, I think. I can't think of an exception where a multi-part picture for me has emerged from the pressure put on one picture, or the idea of one picture. Like in the summer afternoons, just to move over that for a second, because it's a bit easier to explain. I had originally wanted to do only the man. And I didn't even originally want him to be in the nude, as I remember. It was a different subject, but he was on the floor of that room in a sunny day, etc. And I won't try and explain it, but something that was wrong with that starting point led to there needing to be another picture. And that's been the case in a lot of them. However, if you take an older one like The Man in the Street, which is a young man with a bleeding nose.
That early one with the two images,
Yes,
as it were, sutured together.
One of the earlier ones that I did with two parts came from something I'd seen, which was the flash of a change of mood on the part of an actual person. So here he was, and I did see someone with a bleeding nose who suddenly burst into a kind of chuckle, you know, out of the blue. And it struck me that that moment of transition from one mood to the other was not possible within a single image. It was, in that sense, almost cinematic, and it inherently escaped there being a way of capturing it. It wouldn't be possible. So that one clearly required two pictures, but the problem with it was the limitations of one picture. And so it's always the case that I'm trying to make one picture, but I can't succeed. And it generates the problem of that particular subject generates the second or even the third picture. And with Staircase, it's even less clear because I had wanted to somehow explore the theme of, chambered living. People are living close together, but in completely separate spaces. And that usually means some sort of rooming house situation, not a big house or a big apartment. And then, aren't you in an apartment building right now?
Yes.
But you don't feel chambered necessarily.
No.
Because your apartment is too large.
Yep.
So it doesn't have that effect. It has to be shrunken to a certain size before you get that sense. Mm-hmm. Obviously, prison is probably about as basic as it gets. And you could imagine that picture could have been a prison corridor in two cells. But in any case, it had to be some small rooming house. I don't really know why. I just got fascinated by it. And also the idea of photographing Staircase, because it's such a beautiful object. And so it was all kind of mixed motives to make that picture, and I couldn't settle on the motive. But it bifurcated or trifurcated quite quickly into being a study of the simultaneous occupation of two chambers connected and separated by this hallway staircase. Mm-hmm. Very simple. I mean, there's nothing to the subject, really. And so I found that particular rooming house here in LA. And the colors were just astonishing. If I hadn't seen that one, I don't know whether I would have made the picture, because they're that kind of they're not harsh, they're kind of garish. The colors are rather garish and unusual. A lot of interiors you might just see, gray walls or a gray carpet, yes. Nothing. Yes. But the colorism was just remarkable, and I had seen it by accident. I just glimpsed it by accident and then managed to get make a deal with the owner to use it. And that set it off, because I really believe that if I hadn't seen that building, I wouldn't have done that picture. So in a way, it's about that building. It's about that place. And that makes it documentary to a great degree. And so then I did what I had to do to make the picture, and realized it had to be a triptych, because there had to be two chambers bonded, connected by a staircase. So that was a triptych form from the get-go. It wasn't as accidental as the summer afternoons. And the lateral movement you're talking about has to do with a real fundamental contradiction, which is the placing of perspectively deep images adjacent to each other.
Yes.
That creates the fundamental tension, and that tension appears at the joining edges
Yes.
of each image. And so you'll notice that the picture is woven along the edges to become one thing. And the really interesting compositional problem is to take three deep perspectival images and make them into one thing, one composition. It
Yes.
has to be one composition.
Yes.
And there's some obvious things like
that's what
that.
feels almost sculptural about it for me.
Yeah, you could imagine that there were
almost as if you're putting these things together.
Yes, there are three volumetric elements that have to be joined
Joint.
at a
Exactly.
joint, and that
Exactly.
joint is in this case has to be a straight line.
Yes.
Because we're using a rectangular image. And that joinery is the compositional work of the project. So you notice that in the left-hand picture and the middle picture, where you really see the you'll really see the joinery is in the ceilings,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a major disjunction between the ceiling on the right-hand room and the two others.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for a very simple reason. The left picture and the middle picture are photographed with a camera level with the same lens. And moreover, from about the same distance to the motifs. In other words, the distance from the camera to the post of the staircase is not that different from the distance of the camera to the frame of the door the man's standing in. They're not that far apart, and the cameras are level. But in the other picture, the camera's tilted down and there's a different lens. So the ceiling comes in at a completely different angle. You notice how the ceilings torque from
Mm-hmm.
left to right or from
Mm-hmm.
center out. They're just twisting constantly. Now that twisting really fascinates me. And that kind of thing, that's a formal dynamic that really I find the most fascinating and to me as the maker. And I think people miss it a lot because they're looking at a photograph for what's happening. That is what people are doing or usual
Yes.
way. But
Yes.
really what's happening is space is being shown and reconstructed in ways that don't fit necessarily unless you understand the dynamic movement between them. And that's all frozen in the, in the ensemble. And that dynamic aspect of rendering itself is to me what the dramatic part of the photographic drama is how space gets seen. And one of the great things, the things I like about multi-part pictures is you get those disjunctions. It's not dissimilar to what we were just talking about in relation to the cloth being seen in a distorted form.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the same sort of thing. And I guess it goes back to the idea that, things are always changing. As you turn around a room, you're seeing it differently. It's just that the world is always in flux. Things are always mutating. And these mutations are a constant part of your experience, which are kind of unbearable if you pay too much attention to them in real life. You can handle it when it's frozen in a composition, and it makes you understand that the dramatic, almost tormented dynamism of experience is something that is always there. And then the people, they fit into that dynamism, I think, and their relationship is determined by their dynamism, by the dynamism of the space they're in, and by the nature of the space they're in. There's a relation between those two men, I suppose, but I don't know what it is.
Right. Well, I do think this particular work, takes those qualities that you've just described and, to a kind of ne plus ultra. It's in that sense an absolute tour de force.
I like the fact that you see it that way, because it was hard to do. I found it difficult just to take those three rectangular volumes.
I would think so. Good. We also, what you've just described as a defensive formalism of a certain sort. In other words,
I don't think there is such a thing as formalism. I don't think it
no,
exists.
of course not. But what I mean is you're paying attention to relations that are not simply relations of content and subject matter.
No, I mean, of course, there are relations of content because there are images of related architectural zones that people live in and you know, relate to in different ways so that's content, shall we say, but nevertheless they're just forms. They're forms of space, forms of architecture,
exactly. Yes,
etc.
exactly. And also, I mean, in this case, what a crucial element of the job of making this thing work involved this, project of joining.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that
reconciling these different spaces?
Don't you think that all the arts are essentially just composition? The essence of what all the arts have in common is that they are acts of composition, that is bringing together elements, whatever they are, and making something unique and harmonious about them, with them. To me, it wouldn't matter whether it was music, poetry, anything. They're really composing, and I see what I do is essentially composing, and trying to make a unity of some sort from this possibly disparate material. It may not be as disparate as all that. It may not be as disparate in some cases as in others, but it always is to some degree not unified until it's composed. So multi-part pictures are kind of imposed on me by the motif, but they also are kind of challenges in composition. And so I don't see why you shouldn't see analogies to sculptural making in that case. Why shouldn't they be there?
Why shouldn't they? I agree.
That's why photography, I've never really agreed with the idea that photography as an art was that different from other arts. We've had this I've carried this argument on for decades now about how the idea that was so prevalent for a while that photography was inherently other than all the previous arts didn't hold water beyond a certain point because of what we've just been talking about. It has its unique characteristics, but they're related, and I don't I wouldn't want there to be no analogies towards, say, a sculptural, musical, literary, theatrical, uh, qualities that would be somehow perceptible.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the other thing that is striking is that one can feel now relatively unembarrassed about talking about a quality, an aim like unity. I mean, as you well know, early on in your career, that would have been seen as an extremely conservative, including politically conservative thing to say, as if, the only acceptable way to go would be for things to be radically fissured and, disunified. But the fact is, art wants to hang together, wants to hold together. And that seems to be
unity is
basic condition of a certain kind of success.
When we talked with Thierry Leduc a few times about the replacement in his theory of art, or his attitude toward art, of Kant's version term beauty, because he argues that beauty is an irrelevant and outmoded way of judging art. And we get his point, but the counterpoint I would make is that beauty is just a rubric for something that is not necessarily beautiful in the conventional sense. So that this beauty or unity is not one thing. There's endless ways in which that can occur, And it can also occur in art that wants to be fragmented. You know, some artists set up to create fragmentation and create unity in an interesting way. So I don't think it's. I never felt there was anything conservative about it, even though I know that was kind of a rhetorical.
Right, yeah, I completely agree.
reference.
I mean, there's this wonderful sentence in Hazlitt, the essay that he writes about painting. You know, he was trained as a painter, and he says this terrific remark, which holds for everything, which holds for poetry, it holds for one part of a painting shames another. In other words, it just has to be good all the way. It's like imagining it's a totally great sonnet with a completely defective line 12.
Not good.
You know, exactly. You just have to keep working until no one, you know, until line 12 is as good as all the others, if not better.
However, but there's also another counter rule to that, and it shows there's no rules, which is sometimes there has to be a bad line to make it better. that has to happen too. Like the thing that's said about a novel, which is a long narrative that has something wrong with it. Or, you know, Beckett's thing about the object that's complete with its missing part. So there's no way you can actually define what that unity is, because a defect can be better than the lack of a defect.
I think it works for everything except poetry, Jeff. I think there's no more about a lyric poem. There's no margin.
I'll defer to what you say because you're a poet and I'm not. But the point is, I still don't buy it because there aren't any rules. And I also agree, and I think Greenberg made that point quite clearly too, that there are no real criteria that can be imposed on an artist at any given moment. And therefore, there can't be any rules that can be binding. And I agree with him, there are no criteria except the results. And therefore, anything can lead to that result, and it can be surprising. So we have standards, and they generally hold true, but they're not infallible. And so I always insist that a defect in the unity can actually make that unity far more interesting than the one without it. And I think I have a lot of defects in my pictures, and I sometimes finally let them be there because I think the defectiveness is sometimes more convincing, and maybe it is more modern, actually, to accept the defectiveness as against the notion, which is still kind of conventionally classical, about the perfection of the art form. I'm not sure that's really better. And yet, you see, that's just a passing opinion because we can't legislate that even for ourselves. You could be writing your next poem, Michael, and find yourself completely surprised by the fact that you're going to have to accept something that you normally would never accept because the previous several lines forced you into it. Could easily happen, could it not?
It can. Listen, this seems to me, this is great. This seems to me a perfect closing exchange.
All right. I'll close when you say to close.
I think this is, I have to say, I've totally enjoyed this.
Me too. Thank you for doing it.
Oh, it's a tremendous pleasure. Again, congratulations on the show. I wish I could see the one in LA.
It's
and
nice
I hope we get to see each other in person soon.
Yes, that would be great. I'm going to come out. I hope to come out to Glenstone still once more to see the exhibition.
Oh, fantastic.
It could be within the next 3 weeks, so I'll let you know.
Okay, please do.
Yeah, and also I want to say how pleased I was with how that show looks and how they made it look and the kind of place that they have made that me and others can exhibit work at that level of clarity, and the serenity of this rooms worked so well with the kind of pictures that are in them. I was, it's very, very pleased with it.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful hanging, beautiful presentation.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Okay, Michael, thank you.
Okay, warm regards to Jeanette. Great to see you.
And to Ruth, the same.
Yes, okay.
And I'll be in touch if I'm coming out. We'll try and get together because you're not far away.
That would be wonderful.